when a quiet neighbor uncovered a single, crumpled note revealing a little girl's desperate secret. He thought reporting it would be enough. But what he discovered next shook the entire cul-de-sac to its core. Before we dive into this harrowing story of betrayal and bravery, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Eli Martin had lived in the same cul-de-sac for nearly 15 years. Ever since his failed marriage left him with an emptiness he could only fill with routine and the gentle, unspoken companionship of his golden retriever, Benny. In those early days when he first moved in, his ex-wife's final words to him still echoed in every silent room. He had not anticipated that the quiet suburban lane would become his sanctuary, but as the months turned to years, the predictability of mowing the lawn every Saturday, exchanging polite waves with neighbors, and tinkering with woodworking projects offered a curious comfort. He was, by nature, a man who found solace in structure. But as much as he tried to mend the wounds of his past, the house itself always felt a shade too still, as though it were waiting for some life to stir in its corners. He filled his garage with half-finished wooden chairs, benches, and tables, the sawdust and shavings becoming a sort of security blanket. When he was sanding a plank of cedar, he could lose himself in the work, letting his mind drift away from the persistent ache of old memories. He had once dreamed of starting a family, children running across the yard, a partner to confide in at the end of the day. Yet that vision dissolved under the weight of arguments, heartbreak, and, finally, a divorce that cost him more than just shared bank accounts. The neighborhood was relatively small, arranged in a neat semicircle around a single, narrow road that ended in a cul-de-sac. It was the kind of place where people took pride in pristine lawns, carefully tended flower beds, and well-maintained porches. Autumns were a riot of burnt orange and crimson leaves scattered across sidewalks, while winters brought a hush of snowdrifts that reflected holiday lights. Summers were a cacophony of lawnmowers, barbecue scents, and shrieking children, and in spring, everything smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. For Eli, each season in that little suburban enclosure was another chance to pretend all was well. Over those 15 years, neighbors came and went. Some stayed just long enough to complain about property taxes and the occasional raccoon rummaging through trash cans before moving on. Others stuck around, forging superficial relationships with each other through backyard barbecues or block parties. Eli was on pleasant terms with most of them, though he rarely engaged in deeper conversation. He liked offering a quick nod or wave, appreciated short greetings in the morning, and found comfort in not being pressed for more. Everything changed when the Helbridges moved in next door. It began on a Thursday so gray that even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. A large, dark truck pulled into the driveway next to Eli's, followed by a rented moving van. From his living room window, Eli watched as Mr. and Mrs. Helbridge stepped out. They were impeccably dressed even in casual clothes. He wore pressed khaki pants and a fitted polo, while she wore a neat blouse and slacks, her hair pinned in an elegant twist. Their gestures were calm, controlled, and rehearsed, as though they had practiced exactly how to present themselves in a new neighborhood. Then came the girl. Eli caught sight of her peeking from the back seat of the truck, her eyes round with fear or suspicion. She seemed no older than 10, maybe a wisp of a child, thin arms folded around a stuffed toy she clutched to her chest. Even from a distance, Eli noticed she wore a long-sleeved shirt, the fabric slightly frayed at the cuffs, and he vaguely wondered why she would dress so warmly on a day that was muggy with summer heat. Her gaze flicked to his window for a moment, and though he couldn't be sure if she saw him, he felt an inexplicable stab of concern. There was something far too guarded about a child that age. That evening, Eli encountered the family for the first time up close. He had been returning from the grocery store, Benny trotting happily at his side, when Mrs. Helbridge waved him down. "Hello there," she greeted, voice polished. "I'm Carol Helbridge, and this is my husband, Richard." She gestured toward a tall man standing stiffly, arms folded, near the moving truck. He offered a curt nod. "We're your new neighbors." Eli introduced himself, conscious of Benny sniffing at Carol's shoes. "I'm Eli Martin. Lived here a while now. This is Benny." Carol crouched to pat Benny's head. "He's gorgeous," she cooed. Benny wagged his tail, apparently content with the new attention. Richard joined them, giving Eli an appraising look. "Heard this is a quiet neighborhood. Glad to be here." Their tone was warm enough, yet something felt off. Perhaps it was the way Richard's smile never quite reached his eyes, or how Carol's cheery demeanor seemed meticulously orchestrated. Still, Eli knew better than to judge too soon. He simply said, "Well, welcome. Let me know if you need anything." On impulse, he glanced around for the little girl, but she was nowhere in sight. Carol explained in passing, "Our foster daughter, Ava, is inside helping unpack. She's a bit shy." Then, with that polished smile, she changed the subject to ask about trash pickup schedules and local schools. Eli answered the standard questions, all the while fighting the nagging sense that there was more to this situation than fresh neighbors seeking a peaceful new life. He shrugged it off as simple paranoia. After all, he had become guarded, even suspicious, over the years, a side effect of heartbreak and isolation. Days passed. The Halbridges settled into the house next door with remarkable efficiency, converting the modest residence into a model of suburban charm. Carol baked cookies and handed them out to the neighbors. Richard joined a local golf club. They were seen walking arm in arm sometimes, exchanging pleasantries with passers-by. And occasionally, they appeared at the mailbox with their foster daughter, Ava, trailing behind, her face so pale that it appeared almost translucent in the right light. She kept her eyes down, her posture tense as though bracing for a reprimand. Eli tried not to stare, but he couldn't help feeling an undercurrent of dread every time he caught sight of the girl. Then, on a weekend afternoon, while sanding the surface of a cedar table he was building on his front porch, Eli had his first unsettling encounter with Ava. He heard a rustle near the wooden fence dividing his yard from theirs. At first, he assumed it was a stray cat or a squirrel, but then he glimpsed a small hand curling around the fence slat. Pausing his sanding, he peered closer. That was when he saw a single, wide, frightened eye peeking at him through the gap. He froze, uncertain what to do. Slowly, he raised his hand in a little wave, a gentle greeting. The eye blinked, and then disappeared as swiftly as it had come. Eli stood, awkwardly holding the piece of sandpaper, heart pounding. Her behavior was startling, yet it reminded him that she was just a child, curious or anxious, or both. But if she was just curious, why did she seem so frightened? He set aside his work, drifting closer to the fence. "Hello," he called softly, not wanting to alarm her. There was no reply. The yard on the other side fell silent, as though holding its breath. Eventually, he returned to his sanding, mind awash with questions. He convinced himself she was simply shy. Children in new homes often felt nervous. But the next few weeks brought more strange glimpses. He noticed Ava peering from her bedroom window late at night, the faint glow of a lamp illuminating her tense expression. He sometimes spotted bruises on her arms when the sun caught them at the right angle, though she usually concealed them beneath those stubborn long sleeves. And every time Carol or Richard addressed her in public, Ava looked at the ground, lips pressed so tightly together that they almost disappeared. Eli tried to suppress his growing suspicions. He told himself it wasn't his place to interfere in another family's business. His cautious nature warred with an instinctual alarm, some ancient, paternal part of him that yearned to step in and protect. After all, who was he to jump to dire conclusions? Accidents happened, kids fell off bikes or roughhoused. He had no proof of wrongdoing. He decided to mind his own affairs until the day he found the note. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper lodged beneath the fence at the back of his property where the boards were slightly warped. He might never have noticed it if Benny hadn't been pawing at something while sniffing around. Curiosity piqued, Eli bent to retrieve the damp scrap. The handwriting was shaky, the pencil lines faint from smudging, but he made out 2 words clearly enough: "Please help." His heart lurched into his throat. The paper felt almost hot against his palm, and he glanced nervously toward the Halbridge house. The blinds were drawn. The place looked as unassuming as ever. He turned the note over, searching for more clues, but there was nothing. Eli pocketed it and retreated inside, locking the back door as though that would protect him from the unsettling questions swirling through his mind. Eli sat at his kitchen table, the note in front of him, going through a dozen scenarios. Could it be a prank by local kids? Some bored teenager's idea of a joke? But the writing was so earnest and tremulous. He remembered Ava's bruises, her skittishness, that single frightened eye. The implications twisted his stomach into knots. He hesitated for hours, pacing the living room, trying to decide on a course of action. In the end, he picked up the phone and called child services. He felt half-crazed, fearing he might be overreacting, but also unable to ignore the possibility that a child was in serious trouble. A polite-sounding representative took his statement, asked for details, and said they would note his concerns. Then he hung up. Eli stood there, unsettled by the brevity of the conversation. He thought he would feel relief at having reported it, but an odd sense of dread lingered in the air. Days passed, and no visible change occurred. The Halbridge house functioned like a well-oiled machine. Carol continued to appear at community events, always with a perfectly arranged dish in hand, her smiles radiant. Richard waved politely to the neighbors, boasting about his golf scores to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Ava was rarely seen. When she did appear, she seemed to drift behind her foster parents like a gray shadow, head bowed. Eli expected an official from child services to show up at any moment, but none arrived. He received no follow-up calls. Not a whisper of an investigation. He tried to reassure himself that these things took time, that no one would ignore a potential child abuse case. But a week later, when he saw a fresh bruise marring Ava's left cheek at church, a place the Halbridges had begun attending to further blend into the neighborhood, he realized something was deeply amiss. Ava sat quietly next to Carol, who kept an arm around the girl's shoulders in a show of maternal warmth. Eli could only stare, heart pounding. He'd never felt so helpless. He phoned child services again, voice shaking with urgency. The representative was a different person this time, someone who seemed overworked and mildly impatient. She asked if he had any concrete evidence. He mentioned the note and the bruises. She said they would look into it, and promptly ended the call. That was it. Another dead end. Late that night, Eli was jolted awake by Benny barking. At first, he assumed a stray cat was prowling around, but then he heard the muffled scream from next door. He dashed to the window, heart hammering. The Halbridge house was dark except for a faint light seeping through the upstairs curtains. Then came a series of thuds that made his blood run cold. Benny whimpered softly at Eli's feet, sensing his distress. Silence fell soon after. He tried calling the police, but as he dialed, the screaming stopped. By the time he got an operator on the line, he had only vague details to give, possible domestic disturbance, but no visual confirmation. An officer arrived half an hour later, driving by the cul-de-sac with lights off. The house remained dark and still. He knocked on the door. Carol greeted him sweetly, assured him everything was fine, that perhaps a television program had been louder than usual. The officer, with nothing else to go on, left. Eli watched from his own front window, helplessness blooming into rage. That single, horrifying cry had carved itself into his memory. He knew he was not imagining it. Yet in the stillness of the aftermath, it was as though it had never happened. As though it were part of some dream he alone had witnessed. The next day he found the second note. This time, it was folded into a small plastic bag, tucked at the base of the fence. He nearly missed it again, as it was half buried beneath the grass. With trembling hands, he opened the bag. Inside was a damp piece of lined paper, covered in shaky pencil scrawls. They said they'd make me disappear if I told anyone. I don't want to disappear. Please don't let me. His breath caught in his throat. He could picture Ava scribbling this under duress, every letter potentially punishable by her foster parents. A cold fury settled over him. This had gone beyond suspicion. This was a cry for help from a child who believed her life was on the line. He stared at the note for a long while, tears burning in his eyes, old memories of loss and regret gnawing at the corners of his heart. He refused to stand by and watch another young life be ruined or taken away. He reached for his phone, intending once again to contact child services, but a bitter voice in his head reminded him how fruitless his calls had been so far. Something was preventing the system from intervening. Either bureaucracy, or the Halbridges' cunning manipulations, or a combination of both. He needed a different approach, something that wouldn't be so easily dismissed. He decided to start his own careful documentation. Like the old detective shows he used to watch as a kid, he would keep logs of every scream, every suspicious sound, every bruise he observed. He wrote down dates and times. He snapped photos of the notes. He purchased a small digital recording device online, and once it arrived, he ventured outside under cover of darkness to place it near the fence where the Halbridges' voices sometimes drifted through. At first, the device captured little more than crickets and the occasional dog barking in the distance. Then, on the third night, it recorded muffled arguing. Eli listened through headphones, heart pounding as he discerned Richard's voice raised in anger, Carol's panicked hush, and a smaller voice pleading, "Please, please don't," followed by a slamming sound. The rest was silence, broken only by ragged breathing. He made copies of this recording, storing them on different flash drives. His paranoia drove him to stash one in a shoebox in the attic and another in a deposit box at the bank. He was no longer simply anxious, he was afraid. If the Halbridges discovered he was gathering evidence, there was no telling how they might retaliate. And yet he felt morally bound. He couldn't just walk away from that child's desperate pleas. Every day, he battled a swirl of doubts. He was an outsider to the Halbridges' household. Maybe there was an explanation for the bruises. Maybe the child had deeper issues. He questioned his own sanity, but a single memory of the terror in Ava's eyes dispelled any illusions. Something was very wrong, and there was no easy way to fix it. He started visiting various local agencies in person, hoping to bypass phone representatives who might file away his complaints without real follow-up. At each place, he encountered layers of polite bureaucracy. They told him everything from, "We'll look into it," to, "We can't comment on ongoing investigations." But the bruises stayed, the midnight noises persisted, and no adult from child services ever visibly appeared next door. One rainy afternoon, when the clouds hung low and the gutters overflowed, Eli drove to the local police station with a folder of notes, timestamps, and photos. He made a formal complaint to a weary desk officer who listened with a sympathetic ear. The officer took the folder, flipping through the handwritten logs and the still images from his phone. "We'll need some time to check this out," the man said, politely but non-committally. Eli left the station with shoulders hunched, water dripping from the hood of his jacket, wondering how many times he would repeat this pattern before something real happened. When the police did a wellness check the following day, Carol opened the door, exuding pure graciousness. She allowed them into the living room. There, Ava sat with a coloring book. The girl looked up, face impassive, and answered the officer's questions in a small, stiff voice. No, she wasn't hurt. Yes, she felt safe. She just fell sometimes, she said. She was clumsy, always had been. Carol added that Ava had a history of accidents, that she was easily bruised. And so, once again, the police left with nothing to hold on to. Eli's frustration boiled over. At night, he found himself awake at odd hours, scanning the windows for any sign of movement in the Halbridge house. He began noticing that Richard often left late in the evening, returning in the early hours. He had no idea where the man went, but it only fueled his suspicions. Carol would peer outside occasionally, as though on guard. Eli realized he had not seen Ava set foot outdoors for a proper play session since they moved in. Not once. One evening, Eli heard a crash so loud he thought a shelf had collapsed. He raced outside, mind whirling with panic, and saw Richard Halbridge hauling a large black trash bag into the trunk of his car. The man's stance was tense, features unreadable in the dim porch light. Eli hesitated, wanting to call out, but fear anchored him in place. Richard slammed the trunk shut and drove off. Eli stood there, heart pounding, wondering if he had just witnessed something far more sinister than garbage disposal. As these strange incidents escalated, so did Eli's sense of isolation. Neighbors grew uncomfortable around him when he mentioned the screams. Some cast him pitying looks, as though he were imagining ghosts in the night. Others openly defended the Halbridges. "They're good people, always so friendly. Don't be stirring up trouble." Eli realized how easily a polished facade could disguise horrors. The Halbridges wielded that charm with frightening skill. Unable to trust local authorities or child services to act swiftly, he decided to contact someone outside the system, a reporter named Maria Phillips, who had previously investigated a local school board corruption scandal. Eli remembered her fearless pursuit of truth, an article that had exposed bribes and cover-ups at the highest levels. Perhaps, he reasoned, if the story of Ava's plight reached the public, official channels would be forced to pay attention. He called Maria from a payphone across town, an odd, paranoid step, but he wanted to ensure no one traced his involvement back to him until he was ready. He introduced himself only as M, explaining that he had evidence of potential child abuse being ignored by authorities. Maria's voice held a cautious edge. "Send me what you have," she said. "If it's solid, I'll follow up." Eli mailed her a packet containing copies of his notes, the recorded audio on a USB drive, and pictures of Ava's bruises he had managed to snap discreetly from a distance. He included the 2 handwritten notes from Ava, labeled with approximate dates he had found them. He provided detailed accounts of calls to child services, police visits, and the Halbridges' suspicious behavior. Then he waited, anxiety tightening his chest. A week later, Maria called. "This is bigger than I expected," she said quietly. "I'm pursuing it. I need you to confirm a few details." Her questions were precise, probing. Had he personally witnessed physical harm? Where exactly did the bruises appear? Did he have any idea how the Halbridges were staving off investigations? Eli explained as best he could, feeling relief that at least one person with some influence believed him. Maria spent days digging. She unearthed files indicating that the Halbridges had fostered children for the past 7 years, 5 in total, each supposedly relocated to a new foster family. Yet the records contained discrepancies. One child was listed twice under different names. Another had contradictory dates of placement and removal. It was a labyrinth of carefully crafted lies. Most disturbing was the case of a girl who was never officially recorded as leaving the Halbridge household. Her file simply ended, with no forwarding address or official statement. The implication was chilling. Maria confirmed these leads with Eli before she went public. Eli felt his heart hammering as the puzzle snapped into place. He was no longer dealing with a single instance of abuse. This was a pattern, a hidden network of cruelty masked by courtesy and homemade cookies. When Maria's exposé finally broke in the local newspaper and online news sites, it sent shockwaves through the cul-de-sac. The headline read, "Foster care scandal, local couple under scrutiny for potential abuse, missing child." Neighbors awakened that morning to find the story splashed across their screens, complete with allegations, references to anonymous sources, and even partial audio transcripts. Eli had never felt more conflicted, relieved that the truth was emerging, but terrified for what might happen next. The neighborhood reaction varied wildly. Some were horrified, rallying behind any effort to protect Ava. Others doubted the veracity of an anonymous tipster, accusing the journalist of sensationalism. The Halbridges, for their part, issued a terse statement through a lawyer. "These allegations are baseless, and we are cooperating fully with any and all investigations." But behind closed doors, they were surely reeling. Eli saw Richard pacing the driveway in the early morning, phone pressed to his ear, face dark with fury. Carol did not emerge from the house at all that day. Blinds stayed drawn. The entire property seemed to hold its breath. That afternoon, unmarked police cars arrived, along with Child Protective Services. This time, the Halbridges had no choice but to open their doors. Eli watched from his own front window as an official led Ava out. She had her head down, hands trembling around a small duffel bag. Carol stood on the porch, tears glistening, insisting on camera that Ava was making things up for attention and that the reporter had twisted their words. The confrontation escalated quickly. Police began searching the premises, scanning every room, rummaging through files, collecting any relevant documents. Neighbors stood in clumps around the cul-de-sac, stunned, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Eli ventured out to the edge of his driveway, close enough to hear the buzz of conversation but far enough to avoid detection by the Halbridges. The local news van arrived, bright lights capturing every moment. A microphone was thrust toward Carol, who retreated inside. Then the revelations truly began to spill out. Over the course of several days, investigators discovered evidence of repeated abuse, from diaries belonging to former foster children that had been poorly disposed of, to hidden disciplinary logs that included disturbing punishments. Even more damning, they uncovered the meticulously falsified paperwork that had allowed the Halbridges to keep fostering child after child despite multiple complaints. The missing girl's case became a focal point. At first, the Halbridges claimed they had no idea what happened to her, that she had been removed by the agency. But the agency's records contradicted that story. Media outlets dug in, suggesting that perhaps the child had run away or met with a more sinister fate. Though no body was found, the horrifying possibility ignited a firestorm of public outrage. In the midst of it all, Eli continued to maintain his anonymity, even as rumors swirled about who had tipped off the press. Some neighbors guessed it might be him, but most assumed it was a disgruntled social worker or a relative of one of the former foster kids. Eli stayed silent, relieved that the authorities were finally doing their job, yet haunted by the child who might never be found. Ava, meanwhile, was taken into protective custody. She was escorted to a temporary facility for foster children awaiting safer placements, her eyes dull and lifeless. Eli found himself unable to sleep that first night after she was removed, replaying in his mind every time he'd seen her peering through the fence or at the window. He felt a crushing guilt that he had not acted sooner or more decisively. In the aftermath of the story's publication, at least the entire city knew of her plight. Over the following weeks, the Halbridges were officially charged with child endangerment, abuse, and falsifying records. It was the talk of every local news station. Neighbors expressed shock, while some admitted to guilt for ignoring warning signs. "We never saw anything," they insisted, as though that absolved them of the times they might have simply looked away. Eli was torn between relief and sadness. Justice, at least, was beginning to be served, but a single glimpse of Ava's traumatized face told him the damage ran deep. He wrestled with whether to reveal himself as the anonymous tipster. Investigators, fueled by the mounting evidence and testimony from other children who had once lived under the Halbridges' roof, began to suspect someone local had been meticulously collecting data. One detective left a card at Eli's door, requesting an interview. Heart-pounding, he finally called the detective back and agreed to talk. He brought his logs, his recorded audio, and the original notes from Ava. The detective, a grizzled older man named Ridley, listened attentively as Eli explained how he had spent weeks amassing details, desperate to protect Ava. Ridley nodded gravely, impressed by Eli's thoroughness, but also dismayed that it had come down to a private citizen doing the work the system should have done. "This is solid," Ridley said, flipping through the logs. "I wish we had seen this sooner." Eli sighed, a mix of relief and residual anger. "I called child services multiple times, reported everything I saw," he said, voice cracking. "Nobody seemed to listen. Until now." Ridley offered a sympathetic look. "Bureaucracies fail sometimes. We're going to make this right. This evidence will help a lot in court." For a moment, Eli let that sink in. The relief he felt was tempered by the knowledge that no matter how thorough the investigation, it wouldn't erase the trauma Ava had endured or the fate of the missing girl who might never be found. He tried not to dwell on that, but it festered in his thoughts. Ridley thanked him and promised to keep him updated on any developments. In the aftermath, as the Halbridges sat in a county jail awaiting trial, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy stillness. Some folks avoided eye contact with Eli entirely, as though his involvement in exposing the crime made them complicit in their own silence. Others quietly thanked him or left small notes of gratitude in his mailbox. He wasn't sure how to process any of it. The swirling opinions, the complicated emotions, the guilt at not having done more sooner, all weighed on him. Yet, as the days passed, his thoughts were increasingly drawn to Ava. She had lost everything she knew, had been taken from one nightmare into the uncertain world of protective custody. The idea of her being alone in some facility, drifting through her trauma without comfort, kept him awake at night. He confided these worries to Benny as they walked together in the evenings, the golden retriever panting at his side. "What do I do?" he murmured, as though the dog might respond. He finally made a decision. He would ask the agency if he could visit, at least to see how she was doing. Maybe she wouldn't want to see him. Maybe it was none of his business. But he needed to try. He contacted the caseworker assigned to her file, a young woman named Deidre who sounded exhausted yet determined. After a short conversation verifying who he was and what his relationship had been to Ava's case, Deidre agreed to let him come in for a supervised visit. The first time he saw Ava in that stark, plain visitation room, he felt his throat tighten. She was perched on a plastic chair, fiddling with her sleeves, hair limp around her face. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green. When she noticed him, her eyes flickered with recognition and something akin to relief. But she didn't speak. She simply nodded a hello, her hands trembling in her lap. Eli took a seat across from her, a small table between them. Deidre hovered nearby. "Hi," he said softly, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm Eli Martin. We were neighbors." Ava nodded, eyes flicking momentarily to his face. "You found my notes," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes," he replied, swallowing hard. "I did." She hesitated, then spoke in a rush of air, as though she might lose the courage if she delayed. "Thank you." That simple phrase cut through him, tearing at the barriers he had put up to shield himself from heartbreak. He wanted to tell her she never needed to thank him, that he wished he had done more, sooner. But the words tangled in his throat. They both sat in uncertain silence for a long stretch, until Deidre gently prompted Ava if she wanted to share anything. The girl only shook her head, burying her face in her hands. Eli ached to comfort her, but he understood the boundaries. Touch was not allowed in the facility unless explicitly permitted, and Ava needed time to trust. Still, just being there, seeing her safe from the Halbridges, was a start. He visited her once a week after that, always bringing a small token, an interesting rock or a simple coloring book, even a sketchpad. She rarely spoke, but she often drew. She made pictures of houses and trees, a golden dog, a tall man with kind eyes. Eventually, he realized she was drawing him and Benny. Each line was tentative, but the meaning was clear. She found some measure of comfort in that memory. Meanwhile, the Halbridges' trial churned forward. Local headlines blared updates on the child abuse charges, the suspicion of a missing girl, and the scathing revelations about how they had manipulated the system for years. The couple pleaded not guilty, hiring a defense attorney who argued that the entire fiasco was a misunderstanding, that misinformed do-gooders had turned minor discipline into a witch hunt. The public sentiment, however, had largely turned against them. Former foster children, now older, began sharing their stories. Their accounts matched Ava's in disturbing detail: rigid control, isolation, punishments that escalated into physical violence, and a threat to make them disappear if they disobeyed. With each article or televised update, Eli felt both vindicated and horrified. So many children had suffered in silence. He tried not to blame himself for not noticing sooner. He was just a neighbor, after all, and the Halbridges had perfected their facade. Yet guilt gnawed at him. He had been so intent on maintaining his quiet life that he had ignored subtle signs of trouble. In time, court proceedings began in earnest. Prosecutors built a solid case using the recordings, logs, and the testimonies of multiple victims, including Ava. In a private interview with investigators, she finally described what Richard and Carol had done: denying her meals, locking her in a dark closet, beating her if she dared speak out of turn. She recounted how they had threatened that if she ever told anyone, she'd end up vanishing like the other one. When asked about that other child, Ava had no more details, just that the older girl had stopped being around one day and was never mentioned again. Such accounts, combined with the Halbridges' forged paperwork, sealed their fate. The jury took less than a day of deliberation. They were convicted on multiple counts of child endangerment, felony abuse, and falsifying documents. Though the investigation into the missing girl remained open, lacking a final resolution, the Halbridges were sentenced to substantial prison terms. Their property was seized for further evidence collection. The neighborhood had become a symbol of outraged innocence, the place where evil had lurked behind a picket fence. Reporters occasionally still prowled the street, looking for quotes and reactions. Throughout this, Ava remained in the system, awaiting permanent placement. She was offered various homes, but her caseworker noticed how she brightened, relatively speaking, whenever Eli visited. One afternoon, Deidre approached Eli with a gentle suggestion. "Have you ever considered fostering?" She explained that Ava's trust in him was a rare, precious thing in traumatized children. She cautioned that it wouldn't be easy. Therapy, emotional triggers, nightmares. Ava carried deep scars that would take years to heal. The question struck Eli like a lightning bolt. A swirl of conflicting emotions flooded him. He had lived alone for so long, convinced he wasn't capable of family life after his painful divorce. The idea of opening his home to a child, let alone a child so profoundly hurt, felt both terrifying and strangely right. For days, he wrestled with the possibilities, confiding in no one but Benny, who listened with unwavering loyalty. When he finally asked Ava if she would be comfortable staying with him for a while, she nodded without hesitation, her eyes full of cautious hope. The process took time, involving background checks, home evaluations, parenting classes, and interviews with social workers. Yet step by step, Eli discovered that something within him had awakened, the protective, caring impulse that had always wanted a family, a child to nurture. His heartbreak over the divorce had taught him empathy in a way he never could have learned otherwise. When Ava finally moved in, a wave of cautious joy and underlying tension swept through Eli's modest house. He prepared a small bedroom for her, painting the walls a soothing shade of pale green she had pointed at in a home improvement store. He filled a bookshelf with reading material suitable for a 10-year-old and included a few plush toys. Benny, ever intuitive, approached Ava gently, wagging his tail, and soon she began to smile shyly whenever she touched his soft ears. The first night, she had a nightmare, waking up crying with tears streaming down her face. Eli rushed in, carefully comforting her, mindful of her boundaries. She trembled but didn't push him away. In time, they settled into a hesitant routine. Ava attended therapy sessions with a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, who specialized in helping foster children recover from abuse. Eli would sit in the waiting area, flipping through outdated magazines, anxious and hopeful each time. When Ava emerged from these sessions, she often looked tired, but as weeks turned into months, a faint glow of relief replaced some of her fear. She spoke more. She started drawing again, sometimes handing Eli pictures of simple, happy scenes. A doghouse labeled Benny, a figure with short hair and a gentle smile labeled Eli, and occasionally a girl in a sunlit field that she labeled me. As she grew more comfortable, small triumphs emerged, nights without nightmares, shared laughter at silly movies, her first timid attempt to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac. On one such day, as summer shimmered on the pavement, she lost her balance and scraped her knee. Eli rushed over, concerned, but she just blinked back tears, steadied herself, and whispered, "I'm okay," as though trying to prove she could handle life's smaller pains now that the bigger nightmares were behind her. One crisp autumn morning, they attended a court hearing to finalize the question of Ava's long-term placement. Dressed in a modest outfit, hair neatly brushed, Eli had watched countless YouTube videos to learn how to style it. Though he was still clumsy, Ava clung to Eli's hand in the corridor outside the courtroom. The day felt charged with possibility. If all went well, the judge would confirm that Ava could stay with Eli permanently as her adoptive parent. If not, she could be sent elsewhere. They entered the courtroom. The judge, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, asked Ava a few gentle questions about her living situation. Ava spoke quietly but clearly, stating that she felt safe with Eli, that he was teaching her how to walk Benny, how to sand wood, how to trust. The judge nodded, scanning the files containing background checks, therapy updates, and letters of recommendation from Dr. Martinez and Deidre. She spent a tense few moments scribbling notes, then finally looked up. "I see no reason to disrupt a stable, nurturing environment," the judge said. "Barring any unforeseen objections, I will authorize the adoption. Congratulations, both of you." Ava blinked in disbelief, tears welling in her eyes. Eli tried to hold back his own surge of emotion, reaching out to squeeze her hand gently. Outside the courtroom, they stood in the hallway, letting the weight of that decision sink in. Ava leaned her head against his arm, saying nothing, but the gesture spoke volumes. The first weeks after the adoption were a whirlwind of paperwork, excited phone calls from well-wishing neighbors who had finally come around, and a quiet, profound sense of transformation. Eli dedicated himself to making his home truly hers. He converted the attic into a cozy reading nook with plush cushions and a small desk. Ava loved it. She spent hours there, sometimes just gazing out of the skylight at the swaying treetops. He introduced her to board games, taught her how to measure and cut wood for simple crafts, and even tried to bake cookies with her, though their first batch came out burnt. Still, the trauma she'd endured could not be erased overnight. Ava had triggers, sudden loud noises, certain words or gestures that reminded her of the Halbridges, nights when she would wake in a cold sweat. Eli learned to reassure her gently, letting her set the pace. Therapy continued. Dr. Martinez praised Ava's progress but cautioned that healing was a long road. Eli listened, determined to see her through every step. The trial against the Halbridges concluded with a guilty verdict and stiff sentences. Richard's fury erupted in court when the verdict was read, his voice booming with accusations that everyone had turned against him. Carol wept theatrically, still insisting they had only tried to foster troubled children. The judge showed little sympathy. The case of the missing girl remained a haunting subplot, but no new evidence surfaced to explain her fate. The Halbridges maintained absolute ignorance, leaving her a ghost in the records. Eli shielded Ava from most of the trial's media coverage, though it was nearly impossible to avoid entirely. He noticed her flinch any time a news segment replayed the Halbridges' faces. Yet as the days slipped into weeks and the weeks into months, that coverage tapered off. The cul-de-sac resumed a semblance of normalcy. Neighbors mowed their lawns. Kids rode bikes. The houses gleamed in the sunshine, seemingly oblivious to the darkness that had once dwelled in one of them. Little by little, Ava found her voice. One evening, as they were sitting in the backyard, she turned to Eli and quietly asked about his life before she came along. Taken aback, she had never shown much interest in his past. He spoke haltingly about his divorce, about how his wife had left a void he hadn't known how to fill. Ava listened intently, as though trying to piece together how two broken people could form a makeshift family. When she responded, her words were soft but resolute. "I'm not broken," she said, as if challenging him to argue. He smiled, tears prickling the back of his eyes. "No," he agreed, "you're not. You're the bravest person I know." Seasons cycled. Winter brought a light dusting of snow and the hush of holiday lights reflecting on icy sidewalks. Ava discovered the thrill of building a small snowman with Eli's help, dressing it up with a knit cap and a crooked carrot for a nose. Spring arrived with new buds and fresh grass, and Eli taught her how to plant flowers in the yard. He let her choose the seeds, marigolds, lavender, and a few wildflowers. She marveled at their growth, checking every day for the first signs of green shoots. Throughout these changes, the ghosts of her past still lingered. Sometimes she refused to talk, retreating to her room for hours. Other times she would burst into tears over small things, a dropped plate, a stubbed toe, tears that clearly stemmed from deeper wells of pain. Eli learned to be patient, to offer steady reassurance and no demands. Benny, ever watchful, often placed his head on Ava's lap, a living, breathing pillar of support. Over time, Ava found interests that helped her heal. She discovered she loved painting, specifically watercolor landscapes, often featuring an old wooden fence or a certain golden dog. Eli bought her a set of decent paints and brushes for her birthday, and the delighted expression on her face reaffirmed that small acts of kindness could carry immense weight. She hung a few of her paintings around the house. One depicted a tree trunk with a note tucked at its base, the words on the note too small to read but symbolically there. Eli didn't ask for details. He understood the significance. By late summer, with the Halbridges long behind bars, Ava's face had lost some of its guarded tension. She seemed to walk lighter, no longer hugging her arms tight to her body. She and Eli would walk Benny around the block, greeting neighbors who had all but forgotten the scandal. Some invited them for barbecues, showing quiet acceptance of their new family unit. Others still held a trace of discomfort, as though uncertain how to interact with a child whose trauma had once been so public. But Ava rarely noticed, or at least she pretended not to. One day, as they wrapped up a walk, Ava paused in front of the old Halbridge house, which had remained vacant after the authorities seized it. The lawn was overgrown, the windows shuttered. She stared at it for a long moment. Eli tensed, unsure if he should guide her away. But Ava let out a slow breath and turned to him. "I don't hate this place," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Eli blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded, stepping closer to him. "Hating it doesn't help me. And I have you. Benny. My paintbrushes. It's enough." His chest ached with a mix of pride and sadness. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you ever need to talk about anything—" "I know," she said, managing a small smile. Then she resumed walking, each step measured and strong. When the adoption's final legal confirmations arrived, there was a modest celebration at the house. Deidre and Dr. Martinez both attended, along with a few of Eli's neighbors who had been supportive. They ordered pizza, set out balloons, and though it wasn't a grand party, it was exactly what Ava needed. She wore a new sundress with short sleeves, unafraid to show her arms. More importantly, she laughed, a sound so bright and unexpected that it captured everyone's attention. Hearing it, Eli felt a surge of gratitude that words couldn't convey. The memories of how it all began, those desperate notes, the hush of suspicion, the terror in Ava's eyes, lingered at the edges of his mind. But they no longer held him captive. Ava was here, living healing. He had found purpose in caring for her, in offering her the stability he once believed he could never provide to anyone. They were two wounded souls forging a new path forward. On a crisp autumn day, nearly a year after Ava first arrived, they found themselves planting bulbs for next spring. Ava carefully pressed each bulb into the soil with her small hands, glancing up at Eli for guidance. He crouched beside her, showing her how deep to dig, how to cover the bulb with a layer of compost. Benny nosed around, occasionally trying to steal a bulb for a chew toy. They laughed each time they chased him away. Halfway through their work, Ava paused, her gaze drifting to the morning sky. "I never thought life could be this nice," she said softly, struggling to find the right word. Eli offered a gentle smile. "Me neither," he admitted. She looked at him, then, with a brief flicker in her eyes that conveyed more than any words, trust, gratitude, maybe even love. No matter what the future held, they had found each other, and that bond was unshakable. As the seasons turned once more, the final echoes of the Halbridges' reign of terror faded from daily conversation, supplanted by the cyclical hum of suburban life. Eli's days were filled with routine, preparing breakfast, getting Ava ready for school, walking Benny, continuing his woodworking projects in the garage. But now, each routine held a deeper meaning, a reminder of the life and second chance he had helped to preserve. He was no longer just passing time in that quiet cul-de-sac. He was building a family, one step, one day, one act of kindness at a time. And though the scars of the past would never fully vanish, Ava had proven that resilience could bloom in even the most barren soil. Courage, after all, often began with a whispered plea for help, and Eli had been there to hear it. Together, they charted a course toward healing, forging a future bright with possibility. They were, in every sense of the word, survivors. If you believe every child deserves to be heard and protected, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories that champion the truth. Thanks for watching.